The most feared man in 3 states was bleeding out in a chicken coop, and the only person who could save him was a woman the whole town had laughed at 6 hours earlier. Thane Voss had built an empire on the simple principle that everyone could be bought, broken, or buried, and at 37 he'd never once been proven wrong. He wore $4,000 suits, ran the ports and the freight lines of the entire Northeast, and hadn't trusted another living soul since the night that taught him trust was just a slower way to die. Now he lay folded against a frost-bitten fence in the dark, 2 bullets in him, his own blood soaking into Pennsylvania mud, listening to 36 sick chickens shuffle in the cold, while the men who'd betrayed him drove away certain he was already a corpse. And the woman walking toward him with a flashlight had no idea who he was. Her name was Maren Kowalski, 28 years old, a single mother who carried more weight than the world thought a woman should, and absorbed more cruelty than the world thought a woman could. That very morning, the whole of Ash Creek had stood in the farmer's market and watched her count out her last $47 for a crate of dying birds nobody else would touch, half of them wheezing, one of them dragging a twisted leg through the straw. They'd laughed, not viciously, just that tired small-town laugh people save for somebody they've already decided is a lost cause. Her own daughter, 6-year-old Leah, had limped along beside her in a leg brace, picked out the weakest, ugliest chicken in the lot, and named it Biscuit, because Maren had taught her one stubborn thing the rest of that town had never learned. Nothing's broken for good until you stop looking at it close enough to fix it. Maren didn't buy chickens that morning. She bought 36 problems everyone else had given up on, because giving up on the things people throw away was the one thing she'd never once been able to do. And here's what no one laughing in that market could have possibly guessed. In a matter of hours, that exact instinct, that refusal to walk past something the world had already buried, would lead a poor, exhausted woman to drag a wounded crime boss out of the cold and choose to keep him alive. Not knowing his name, not knowing his sins, not knowing that the moment she pressed her hands to his wound, she'd tie her little girl's future to the deadliest man on the eastern seaboard. The man who trusted no one was about to owe everything to the one person nobody respected. And the empire that wanted him dead didn't have the faintest idea it had just made the worst mistake of its existence. If a story about being underestimated speaks to you, do me a favor and tap that like button right now. Share this with one person who needs to hear that kindness isn't weakness. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss where this one goes. Now let's go back to that cold autumn morning in Ash Creek, before the gunshots, before the blood, to the moment a woman everyone laughed at picked up a crate of broken birds and quietly changed 2 lives forever. The first cold of the season in Ash Creek that morning carried the smell of damp metal and rotting leaves. The kind of smell Maren Kowalski had grown so used to that she almost didn't notice it anymore, and she stepped into the farmer's market, with $47 folded in half inside her coat pocket. Money she had counted and recounted all week to buy flour, dried beans, a little cheap meat, and maybe a sack of coal if anything was left over. Practical things, the kind of things that helped a family of 2 survive a Pennsylvania winter inch by inch instead of mile by mile. And yet her feet stopped in front of the wooden crate set on top of old Harland Pruitt's oil drum. A 58-year-old man with a bankrupt chicken farm and the eyes of someone who had stopped hoping a long time ago. Inside the crate were 36 chickens that anyone with even a scrap of common sense would have walked past without a second look, their feathers ragged and matted, a few of them wheezing, as if there were water trapped in their chests. One curled tightly in the corner with a twisted leg bent backward, and Pruitt didn't even bother trying to sell them. He only shrugged when he saw her looking, and said the whole flock had some respiratory sickness. Probably mites, too. That they had just fallen ill a few days ago, after he had spent 3 weeks trying to sell the farm, and not a single soul had touched them. That it was all of them, or none of them. Final price. Because he would rather sell them off than count bodies every morning. Maren stood there longer than she had meant to, and what kept her from walking away wasn't some shallow kind of pity, but something far more stubborn than that. The thing her mother, when she was still alive, used to call the worst flaw in that girl, the flaw of never being able to pass by something the whole world had already sentenced as ruined, without stopping long enough to look closely and see whether they were right. Because when she looked into that crate, she didn't see 36 dying chickens. She saw 36 problems everyone in Ash Creek had collectively decided were hopeless. And the distance between those 2 ways of seeing was the whole of who she was. She thought about the practical things waiting for her at home, thought about the electric bill taped to the refrigerator door, thought about her daughter's shoes that had already been too tight since last month, and she knew very well that a sensible mother would turn away, would buy the flour and dried beans as planned, would go home and never think about this crate of chickens again. But then she thought of her daughter, of that morning 6 years earlier when they had placed a premature baby into her arms. A baby with one weak leg, and the doctor's quiet little shakes of the head, those head shakes that said this child would be a burden, that some things were born incomplete, and people should prepare themselves for that truth. And she remembered standing there, holding her child, thinking only one thing, that not a single person in that room had been willing to look at the baby closely enough to see that she was alive, that she was breathing, that she was gripping Marin's finger with all the strength she had. 6 years later, that same child stood beside her in the market, and Marin understood that she couldn't teach her daughter that nothing was truly broken if someone was willing to look closely enough and then turn her back on a crate full of living creatures the whole town had given up on, because children don't learn from what adults say. They learn from what adults do when they think no one is paying attention. So she slipped her hand into her coat pocket, her frozen fingers searching for the folded bills, and she counted out the last of her money, placing it into Pruitt's calloused palm without offering a single word of justification, because she knew anything she said in that moment would sound either too noble or too foolish, and neither one would be true to what she was feeling. Pruitt took the money and looked at her with the baffled eyes of a man who had just been relieved of a burden, and yet had also witnessed something he couldn't begin to explain. Then he helped her lift the crate down from the oil drum, and its weight dropped into her arms at once, heavier than she had imagined, heavy in the way all real decisions are heavy. And in the moment, she tightened her grip around the crate's flimsy wooden edge. 28-year-old Marin Kowalski knew very clearly that she had just traded the winter ahead for something no one believed could be saved, and she also knew, deep in the most stubborn part of herself, that she would prove every last one of them wrong. Marin's rented house sat at the end of a dirt road that ran out toward the edge of town. A faded one-story wooden house the landlord couldn't be bothered to repair, and she couldn't afford to demand anything of, with the north shutter loosened since the previous fall, clattering every time the wind came in from the empty fields. And when she hauled the chicken crate across the threshold in the late afternoon, both her arms were so worn out they trembled, but she didn't allow herself to sit down yet, because there was still too much to do before darkness settled in completely. She cleared a corner in the old shed behind the house, lined it with dry straw, set up a heat lamp she had kept from the time when she could still afford to raise a few laying hens before everything collapsed, and moved each sick chicken into that space with hands so gentle they seemed almost strange for someone so exhausted. Her life was measured by things like that, by work shifts that ran one into another without end, mornings at the vegetable stall in the market, and evenings in the kitchen of a highway diner, by dollars already promised to someone else before she ever touched them, by the debt her former husband had left behind before disappearing. The man who had decided that an imperfect child and a wife who wouldn't give up were more weight than he could bear, and the way he left was still a silent groove, cut into the way she looked at herself whenever she faced a mirror. She had just finished turning on the heat lamp when Delphine Carter stopped by, as she always did, the 34-year-old woman who sold goods beside Marin's stall at the market, the only friend left who didn't look at her with pity. Delphine stood in the shed doorway and watched the wheezing flock for a long while, then only sighed, without scolding, without asking why, simply setting a still warm box of food on the doorstep and telling Marin to remember to eat something before she collapsed, then adding that if Marin needed anything, she should call, though both of them knew Marin never would. After Delphine left, the house sank into the private quiet of places where one adult carried everything, and Marin went inside, where her daughter was sitting at the kitchen table beneath the weak yellow light, carefully taking off the metal brace from her leg the way her mother had taught her, massaging her thin calf with the exact motion the physical therapist had shown them long ago, a 6-year-old child already far too used to the fact that her body needed more patient care than other children's bodies did. And that sight, the little girl calmly tending to her own imperfect leg, was the thing that always made Marin's heart twist with pain and fill at the same time with a pride she never said aloud. That night, after her child had fallen asleep, she didn't go to bed right away, though her bones were crying out for rest. Instead, she took out a worn, hard-covered notebook, the cheap kind bought at a dollar store, and under the kitchen light, she began doing the thing that would later shape everything. She wrote down each chicken one by one, numbered them, described the breathing of this one, the twisted leg of that one, which bird would eat, and which would not, which one still had life in its eyes and which one had already begun to surrender. Each careful line written as long as she looked closely enough and wrote clearly enough, she would find the thing other people had never bothered to look for. She knew nothing about veterinary medicine, had no money for medication, had no one to teach her. All she had was observation and patience, and the stubborn belief that every problem had its own shape if a person was willing to look hard enough to see it. And in the small kitchen of a sleeping Rust Belt town, the woman all of Ash Creek considered a loser bent over that notebook and kept writing, not knowing that less than an hour's drive from her town, in an entirely different world built from money and blood and fear, there was a man who was also lonely in his own way, and that the fates of two people with nothing in common were about to collide in the darkness of that very night. That same afternoon, less than an hour's drive from Ash Creek, in an office on the highest floor of a building overlooking the Philadelphia harbor, Thane Voss stood with his back to the glass doors, holding a glass of malt whiskey he hadn't brought to his lips, listening to a man kneeling on the expensive carpet beg for his life, and he felt nothing at all. No anger, no pity, only the cold calculation of a man too accustomed to placing human value on a scale and reading the result. The man on the floor had skimmed money that didn't belong to him for months, thinking the Thane empire was too vast to notice a few numbers out of balance, and that was exactly his mistake. Because Thane knew every number in every ledger belonging to Thane Combine, the enormous network that controlled the ports and freight routes running along the entire Northeast, a machine lubricated by both legitimate money and money that would never be declared, and the principle that had built that empire was simple to the point of cruelty, that anyone could be bought, broken, or buried. And throughout all his years in power, he had never once seen that principle fail. He gave a very slight signal, only a tilt of the head so faint it was almost impossible to notice, and two of his men helped the traitor to his feet and took him outside. There was no gunshot in this luxurious room, because Thane never allowed violence to dirty the place where he stood. Violence was something that happened elsewhere, in the dark, by someone else's hands, cleanly and decisively, like everything he touched, and only after the door closed did he take a sip of whiskey, the smoke spreading across his tongue without bringing him the smallest pleasure, because for a very long time now, everything to him had been function rather than flavor. Renata Falk entered without knocking, a 45-year-old woman with short silver-streaked hair and the gait of someone who had never wasted a single step in her life, the only person in the entire organization allowed to enter his office without warning, not because he trusted her in the way ordinary people understood trust, but because for many years she had been the sharpest and most useful instrument he possessed. And Thane had stopped believing in people after a night long ago taught him that trust was only a slower way to die. So even with Renata, he always kept a cold distance, an invisible pane of glass she had never tried to step through. She placed a thin file on the desk and said in an even voice that there had been some unusual movement in the Western branch's cash flow, expenses that didn't match, meetings that weren't on the schedule, and that a few old faces in the family had recently grown too quiet in that way. Silence sometimes became louder than speech. Thane listened without turning around, his eyes still fixed on the cargo ships releasing smoke beneath the gray harbor. And then he said only that loyalty in this world had an expiration date like everything else, and that he had lived long enough not to be surprised when it ran out. Renata looked at him for a moment with an expression that, on someone else, might have been called concern. Then she said plainly what only she dared to say, that he had clenched the entire organization so tightly inside his fist that if that fist ever loosened one day, there wouldn't be a single person left standing beside him. That a man who trusted no one would, in the end, have only himself when it mattered most. Thane smiled very faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, and answered that being alone had never killed anyone, betrayal had, and that he would rather be lonely than leave even the smallest opening for a knife to slip through. He set the glass down, put on his dark overcoat, and told Renata that tonight he would drive himself back to the house in the suburbs to handle a few matters alone, brushing aside her offer to add more escorts, because in Thane Voss's mind at that moment, the greatest danger still came from those far away, not from those standing close, and that was the only mistake his entire life of cold calculation failed to foresee, the mistake that, only a few hours later, would leave him lying barely alive in the darkness, in a place where no expensive suit and no powerful dollar could reach him to save him. Thane changed his mind at the last minute and let one of the drivers who had served him the longest take the wheel, A quiet man named Gareth who had driven him for nearly 10 years and was the closest thing to a familiar presence he allowed. And the black car rolled out of Philadelphia after night had fully fallen, gliding smoothly along the highway before turning onto a deserted stretch of state road that cut through the black countryside near Ash Creek, with nothing on either side but fields stripped down to stubble and, now and then, the lonely light of a farmhouse drifting past in the glass. Everything happened so quickly that even Thane, a man who always calculated every move ahead of time, couldn't understand what was happening fast enough. A truck with no lights shot out diagonally and blocked the road right at the curve. Gareth swore, slammed the brakes, and jerked the wheel, but at that same instant, from the dark roadside, gun muzzles burst into flowers of fire. Glass shattered into 1,000 pieces. Bullets tore through the body of the car like the sound of ripping cloth magnified 1,000 times, and Thane had only enough time to throw himself low with the instinct of a man who had survived too many things, while Gareth in the driver's seat never even managed to cry, before collapsing over the steering wheel and sending the car completely out of control. 2 bullets struck Thane almost at the same time, one ripping through his ribs, and the other sinking deep below his shoulder, the pain arriving later than the impact. At first only heat, then breaking open into an agony so sharp it darkened his vision, and the car smashed through the roadside fence, bounced wildly across a ditch, and plunged nose first into a dark field, the engine screaming one final time before cutting out, leaving behind a silence more frightening than the gunfire. Thane lay there inside the twisted cabin, hot blood soaking through the side of his expensive overcoat, his ears thick with ringing, and through the broken glass he saw flashlight beams wavering closer, heard shoes grinding over the dirt, then the voices of the men who had just shot him carrying toward him, cold and practical, one voice saying to check and make sure, another grumbling that there was no need to waste time because no one could take 2 bullets at that distance and live through a night this cold, that they should leave him there and let the cold and death finish their work. And Thane Voss, the most powerful man in 3 states, lay holding his breath and pretending to be dead in a pool of his own blood, understanding for the first time in his life what it meant to be completely helpless, because these men weren't strangers. He had heard those voices before in rooms that belonged to his own family, and that betrayal cut deeper than both bullets. They lingered just long enough to make certain there was no movement left inside the car. Then, like workers who had finished their job, they climbed into the truck and backed away from the road, the headlights sweeping one final circle across the dark field before disappearing, leaving Thane alone with the wind and the ticking sound of the cooling engine. He knew that if he stayed still, he would die, simply and certainly, like every number in his ledgers, and the ruthless will that had once built an entire empire now gathered itself into one single command, sent to his failing body, that he had to get up. He dragged himself out through the warped doorframe, fell face first onto the hard, cold earth. Then, with the one arm that could still move, he began to crawl, inch by inch, leaving a dark trail behind him across the field, crossing the darkness toward the only weak light he could see in the distance. A pale yellow glow spilling from a low structure at the edge of a poor farm. He didn't know what it was, and he no longer had the strength to care. Each time he moved forward, pain surged up as if it meant to drag him under into unconsciousness. His blood kept seeping into the Pennsylvania mud. His breaths grew shorter and turned white in the cold, and so the man who had once believed he could buy or bury anyone in the world dragged himself toward that last miserable place, where fate had quietly prepared for him a meeting no calculation of his could have foreseen, before the darkness finally closed over him, and he collapsed completely onto the frozen ground, motionless. Marin woke before the sun had fully risen, the way she always did, brewed a mug of weak coffee in the kitchen that was still bitterly cold, then pulled on her coat and went out to the shed to check on the sick chickens, her heart half anxious and half hopeful that the first night hadn't taken any of them. She was walking along the familiar path when she froze, because across the frost-whitened ground there was a dark trail stretching from the field all the way to the shed door, a trail that the rational part of her recognized as blood, before she could even give it a name. And then she saw him. A man collapsed beside the shed wall under the weak glow of the heat lamp she had left on through the night, dressed in an expensive dark suit that was now torn to pieces and soaked with blood, his face as pale as wax, his lips turned purple from the cold. And in that instant her heart began pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Every sensible voice in the world rose inside her head at once, telling her to step back, to run into the house and lock the door, to call the police and leave this man to the people paid to handle things like this. That a blood-covered man appearing in the middle of the night at the edge of a farm was never anything good. That she was a single mother with a small child asleep inside the house, and she had no right to invite danger home to her daughter. And every one of those voices was right. Everyone was wise. Everyone was exactly what anyone in Ash Creek would have told her to do. But she bent closer, and she saw his chest still rising and falling ever so faintly, saw one thin white breath still escaping into the cold. And in that very moment the most stubborn part of her, the part that had led her to the chicken crate the day before, spoke up again and drowned out everything else. Because Maren Kowalski had never been able to stand before a living thing that was still breathing and turn away with the excuse that saving it would be too troublesome or too dangerous. She didn't care who this man was, didn't care why he was covered in blood in the middle of a field. She knew only one simple and absolute thing, that he was bleeding, and he would die if no one was willing to look at him closely enough, and she was the only person there. The first thing she did wasn't first aid, but to turn and look toward the house, because what frightened her most in that moment wasn't the strange man, but the possibility that her daughter might wake up and see this, because a 6-year-old child shouldn't have the image of blood and a fallen body burned into her memory. So Maren hurried back into the house, gently closed her daughter's bedroom door tight, set an extra chair lightly against it, and left a note saying that Mama was out in the shed taking care of the chickens and that she should sleep a little longer. Only then did she go back outside with a basin of warm water, several clean towels, a roll of cheap gauze from the family medicine box, and every small, inadequate thing she had. She slipped her hands under his arms and pulled. His body was heavy as stone, and every dragging step made her arms burn, but she gritted her teeth and managed to get him deeper into the shed, out of the wind, laying him down on the dry straw near the heat lamp. Then, trembling, she peeled away the blood-soaked layers of clothing so she could see clearly, and when she saw the 2 wounds, she almost let go from fear. But she drew in one deep breath and did what she had always done with every problem in her life. She forced herself to look straight at it instead of turning away. She pressed a towel hard against the place where the blood was flowing fastest to slow the bleeding, cleaned around the wounds, and wrapped them tightly with hands that weren't trained but were strangely steady, speaking softly to him all the while in meaningless, gentle words, the way she would soothe a terrified animal, telling him to keep holding on to his breath, telling him that he wasn't dead yet, not yet. And in that poor shed, thick with the smell of straw and blood and sick chickens, the woman the whole town considered a loser knelt all morning beside a stranger and held on to each of his breaths for him, completely unaware that she had just brought into her home the most dangerous thing she had ever touched. Thane woke close to noon, and the first thing he felt wasn't pain but disorientation, an alarm instinct roaring through his body that told him he was in an unfamiliar place and out of control, which, to a man like him, was more terrifying than any wound. So his first reflex was to grab the nearest thing, and the nearest thing was the wrist of the woman bending over him to change his bandage. He seized it with the last scraps of strength he had left, his voice hoarse and ice-cold as he asked where he was, who had brought him here, and how much they had paid her to keep him alive long enough for them to come back. Maren didn't yank her hand away, didn't scream, didn't panic in the way he had spent his whole life watching people do whenever he touched them. She simply stood still and let him squeeze, looking straight into his eyes with a calmness that nearly confused him, then said very softly that if he wanted to break the wrist of the person who had spent the entire morning stopping his bleeding, he was welcome to do it. But once he finished, he would be lying there bleeding again, and this time, no one would trouble herself to sit with him. That sentence, and especially the way it was spoken without fear and without bitterness, made his hand slowly loosen, not because he trusted her, but because his natural cold logic recognized that she was right, that he was in the weakest position of his life, and threatening the only person helping him was a foolish move, and Thane Voss never made a foolish move. He released her hand and leaned back against the wall of the shed, panting, his eyes sharp as knives still sweeping over the miserable room, measuring every exit, every danger, every possibility. Then he asked again, his voice less harsh now but full of suspicion, why she had saved him, whether she knew what kind of man he was, whether she understood that simply keeping him in this shed was enough to put her and anyone living with her in mortal danger. And he waited for the familiar answer. He waited for her to ask for money, for guarantees, for something. Because in his world, no one did anything without a price. But Marin only wrung the towel into the basin of water that had turned pink, not looking at him, and answered that she didn't know who he was and didn't care who he was, that she didn't care what he had done or what name people called him where he came from. The only thing she cared about was that he was bleeding, and a bleeding person needed the bleeding stopped. It was as simple as that, and she said it with such calmness that he couldn't find even the smallest crack of calculation in it, which only made him more unsettled, because all his life he had learned to read people by what they wanted, and this woman seemed to want nothing from him at all. He didn't believe that. Of course he didn't. Trust had long ago become a deadly luxury to him, so he pushed his confusion aside and immediately turned to the only thing he knew how to do in a crisis, which was to take back control. He asked where his phone was, and when Marin handed him the phone with its cracked screen, the one she had found in his coat pocket, he turned his back to her with what little strength remained in order to hide the screen, pressed a sequence of numbers that only he and one other person in the world knew, and when the other end picked up, he said only that he was alive, that no one was to be trusted, and that this person should come to this place alone, absolutely alone, then gave the location he had guessed from what he could see. When the call ended, he gripped the phone in his cold sweat-dampened palm, his eyes still fixed on the back of the woman quietly cleaning up the blood-soaked gauze, and in Thane's mind at that moment, this woman still wasn't a savior, but an unsolved variable, an unanswered question. And he told himself that as soon as he was strong enough to stand, he would have to find out what she truly wanted. Because in the world where he had lived his entire life, kindness that asked for nothing was the most dangerous thing of all, either a lie or something he had never known how to place anywhere it fit. Renata Falk arrived when the day had already begun to slope toward evening, driving an unmarked car and parking it some distance from the farm before walking in, following the cautious instinct of someone who never let her vehicle sit directly in front of a place that needed to remain secret. With her came an older man carrying a medical bag, a doctor who had lost his license many years earlier and had lived ever since by stitching up wounds that would never be reported to anyone, the kind of doctor only people in Thane's world knew how to find. When Renata stepped into the shed and saw that Thane was still alive, her face, usually cold as stone, shifted for one brief moment in a way only someone very observant would have noticed, and then she immediately returned to professional calm, signaling for the doctor to begin. While the man numbed the area, removed the bullet, still lodged beneath Thane's shoulder, stitched the 2 wounds with neat pulls of the needle, and hung a bag of intravenous fluid from a beam in the shed, Renata stood back in one corner and quietly told Thane everything she had managed to uncover. She confirmed what he had sensed the moment he heard the voices in the dark the night before, that the ambush had been arranged from inside, by people who bore his own family name, and that by now, all through the organization, word was spreading that Thane Voss had died in a car accident on a deserted state road, his body not yet found but his death doubted by no one. She added that Gareth's body had already been secretly recovered and quietly laid to rest by her trusted contacts, ensuring no loose ends remained for the enemy to track. The mastermind clearly believed he had been left behind in that cold field, and Renata looked straight at him and said that this mistaken belief was now the most valuable asset he had, because no one kept hunting a dead man. A dead man could move through the darkness without being watched, and if he revealed himself too soon, he would lose the only advantage left to him while inviting a third bullet far more certain than the first 2. Thane, though his face was still deathly pale and his voice still weak, grasped the logic at once, and he asked the question he had asked all his life whenever he stood amid wreckage. He asked what the plan was. Renata answered that he needed a place to recover where no one in his world would ever think to look, not any of the organization's safe houses, because every safe house might already have been sold out, not a hospital because hospitals had to report gunshot wounds to the police, but a place so ordinary it sat outside every map of calculation his enemies possessed. Then she let her eyes move around the miserable shed and out toward the faded wooden house, and both of them understood that the safest place for the most powerful man, in 3 states, at that moment, was the home of the poorest woman in the area. But Marin, leaning against the shed doorframe and having heard more than they thought she had, didn't accept that easily. She stepped forward and said plainly that this was her home, that she had a 6-year-old daughter sleeping less than 30 steps from this shed, and that she had stopped a stranger from bleeding to death because she couldn't do otherwise. But sheltering a man who was being hunted to his death was something else entirely. She asked Renata directly what would happen to her daughter if the people who had shot him found him here, and for the first time, her voice trembled, not out of fear for herself, but from the only fear that could shake her calm. Renata looked at this woman with a silent reassessment, realizing she wasn't someone who could easily be bought and wasn't someone who could easily be frightened. And then she said with rare honesty that precisely because no one on earth would imagine Thane Voss hiding in a place like this, it was the safest place for both him and her daughter, that in a few days, when he was strong enough, they would leave and vanish from her life forever. And while Maren stood there, weighing her fear against her stubborn conscience, Thane's eyes followed her silently from the straw, looking at that woman for the first time not as a variable to be solved, but as a person who had placed the safety of her child on the scale, right in front of him without trying to hide it at all. The days that followed stretched into many weeks, and Thane Voss, a man who had never stayed still in one place for very long in his life, was forced to slow down, according to the rhythm of a body recovering from too much lost blood. At first, only lying on the folding bed Maren had cleared for him in the corner of the shed, then gradually growing strong enough to sit up against the wall, and from that quiet position he began doing the thing he had always done best in his life, observing, except this time what he observed wasn't ledgers or enemies, but the woman who had saved him. He watched her step into the shed every early morning before work, and every late night after her shift ended, worn down to the bone yet still bending over the sick flock with a patience he couldn't understand at all. He saw that she didn't treat the chickens by throwing money at them or leaving everything to luck, but did it like a scientist without a degree. She opened the frayed-covered notebook, reread what she had written the night before, then adjusted each small thing, changing the way she mixed warm water for the chicken wheezing the worst that day, separating the one showing signs of spreading illness into a corner the next, writing down which bird had improved and which one was still standing in place, and every observation was set down in her careful handwriting, as if each chicken deserved that much attention. Thane was used to a kind of power built on fear. He gave orders and people obeyed because they feared the price of disobedience. He got everything he wanted by making others believe that opposing him meant destroying themselves, and that was the only language he believed was real. So when he watched this woman, day after day, wrest life back for creatures that couldn't repay her with anything, not money, not loyalty, not even gratitude they couldn't begin to understand, he found himself facing a kind of power entirely foreign to him, a kind of strength that didn't need anyone to be afraid in order to work. He noticed that the chickens responded to her not with terror but with a quiet trust. They stopped struggling when she lifted them. They stretched their necks toward her when they heard her footsteps, and that small sight stirred something uneasy inside his chest, because it exposed a truth he had spent his whole life denying, that there were things in this world that couldn't be bought with money and couldn't be forced through fear, but could only be earned through repeated, patient kindness that asked for nothing in return. He had once believed patience was a sign of weakness, that kindness was a luxury only people who had never had to survive could afford to display. And yet here, in this miserable shed, he witnessed a woman drained of money and dismissed by the whole town possessing a discipline more enduring than any loyal foot soldier he had ever had, a resilience that didn't come from ambition or terror, but from a deep belief that nothing deserved to be abandoned simply because saving it was hard. One evening, he saw her sitting for a long time beside the weakest chicken, the one she had been sure the night before wouldn't survive, and yet it was still breathing. She didn't cheer, she didn't grow smug, she only quietly added one more line to her notebook and gently adjusted the straw to keep it warmer. And it was that ordinary moment, more than any words could have done, that began to shake something very deep and very old inside Thane Voss, making him wonder for the first time in many years whether the way he had understood strength his entire life was truly the only way, or only the one way a man who had feared trust as much as he had could bear to believe in. Maren had tried her best to keep her daughter away from the shed during those first days, but children have their own kind of instinct for the things adults try to hide. And one afternoon, while Maren was still at work, Leah, with her braced leg and her familiar limping walk, found her way behind the house on her own and pushed the shed door open just a crack, then stood there looking at the strange man with wide round eyes that held not the slightest trace of fear, only the clear curiosity of a child who had never been taught that there were people in this world she was supposed to be afraid of. Thane, a man whose slightest frown was enough to make grown men go pale, suddenly found himself having no idea what to do before this tiny creature who simply walked in and plopped down on a little stool a few steps away from him, then asked whether he was the sick person her mother was treating. And before he could answer, the little girl answered for him, saying that her mother could fix anything, that her mother was very good, that her mother was even treating all the sick chickens too. She didn't treat him like a crime boss or a dangerous man or even a stranger, but like a new friend who had happened to appear inside her small world. She told him all sorts of rambling stories in her bright, chirping voice, bragged that the brace on her leg was a little bothersome but helped her walk more steadily, asked whether he liked chickens, then firmly tugged at his hand as if the fact that he had just been hit by 2 bullets meant nothing at all, determined to lead him to the corner of the shed so he could see the chicken she loved most. It was the weakest, ugliest chicken in the whole flock, the one with the twisted bent leg that she had chosen on the very day at the market and given a name. And now the little girl lifted it with her tiny hands in a careful, tender way, held it out in front of him, and introduced it with pride that carried not a trace of embarrassment, telling him that when it first came home, everyone had thought it was going to die, that it was the weakest one, but now it already knew how to go looking for food on its own, and Thane looked at the crippled chicken nestling into the child's palms and felt his throat tighten in a strange way. Then the little girl said the thing that shook his entire being. She said it in the casual voice of a child merely repeating a truth her mother had taught her the way one teaches a lullaby, that Mama said nothing is completely broken, people just haven't looked at it closely enough to know how to fix it yet, and she said those words while stroking the lame chicken as if it were the most obvious living proof of that truth, not knowing that every single word was driving itself straight into the man sitting before her. Because Thane Voss had lived his whole life with the silent belief that he was the thing that had been broken beyond repair long ago, that there were wounds inside a person so deep nothing could ever stitch them closed, that he had gone too far down the road of blood and coldness to ever become anything else, and he had used that very belief to justify every cruel thing he had ever done, because if something was already broken, what else did it have to lose? And yet now, a 6-year-old child with an imperfect leg, holding in her hands an animal the whole world had already decided to throw away, was telling him with absolute innocence that nothing was completely broken if someone was willing to look closely enough, and the thick layer of ice he had packed around his heart for so many years, the thing no threat, no negotiation, and no betrayal had ever managed to pierce, began to crack before one child's sentence. And when Leah looked up and asked whether he wanted to hold the chicken for a moment, Thane Voss, the man who trusted no one, reached out the hand that had spread fear across 3 states, and took that small, trembling life into it, very gently, as if he were afraid of hurting it. After that afternoon, when Leah placed the crippled chicken into his hands, something between Thane and Marin changed, and in the nights that followed, after the child had fallen deeply asleep, Marin began lingering in the shed longer than she needed to, bringing him a cup of weak coffee before sitting down on the little stool, and in the private silence of people too tired to pretend, 2 people who had never had anything in common began telling each other things they had never told anyone. One night, when she asked why a man like him didn't have a single family member to call when he was hovering between life and death except that silver-haired woman, Thane stayed silent for a very long time. Then, in a low voice so flat it was frightening, he told her something he had never spoken aloud, that there had once been a time when he had believed in people too, that the faraway night that had taught him the lesson of a lifetime was the night the people he loved and trusted completely had sold him out in exchange for power, that he had lost the only family he had left in that very betrayal, and from those ashes he had built for himself a cold rule of survival, that if he never trusted anyone, no one could ever kill him from the inside. He had turned his heart into a weapon and his cruelty into armor, and he had survived. But the price of that survival was becoming a man who, even while lying there waiting to die, had only one phone number to call. Marin listened without judging him, without looking at him with pity, only nodding very softly like someone who understood too well what it meant to be turned away by the very people who were supposed to love you. Then it was her turn, and for the first time, she told someone outside her own life about the wound she carried, about the former husband who had left at the moment when she needed him most, the man who had looked at their little daughter with her imperfect leg and decided that an incomplete child and a wife who refused to give up were more weight than he could bear, and he had walked away, leaving her with a debt and a town that looked at her with the eyes of people who had long since placed her among the losers. She confessed something she had never even told Delphine, that the greatest fear of her life wasn't poverty, wasn't contempt, wasn't the work shifts that wrung her dry, but the fear that one day she wouldn't be strong enough to protect her daughter from a world always ready to stamp the word broken on anything that didn't look like everyone else, and that every night when she bent over the notebook recording the chickens, It was also a way of telling herself that if an animal everyone had abandoned could still be saved, then her daughter would be all right too. That her patience meant something. In the moment she said that, Thane looked at her with an expression he himself didn't realize had changed, because for the first time in his life, he had met someone who carried a wound strangely like his own. Both of them had once been judged by the people who should have stood beside them as burdens, as things better left behind, and both had chosen opposite roads in order to survive. He had built a cold wall so no one could touch him anymore, while she kept opening her heart again and again, even though it kept leaving her hurt, and yet she, the one who had chosen the more fragile path, seemed many times steadier than he was. There was a very small moment between them that night, when her hand accidentally brushed his as she took the coffee cup, and they both went still inside, a silence crowded with everything left unsaid. A dangerous closeness they both understood but neither dared to name, because he knew very well who he was and what he carried with him, while she knew very well that letting a man like him into her heart meant placing both herself and her daughter at the edge of a world filled with blood. So they both stepped back, both held on to that final distance. But once the seed had taken root, nothing could pull it back. And when Maren stood, wished him good night, and walked out into the cold darkness, Thane Voss remained alone in the shed and realized, with a fear greater than the fear of being shot, that for the first time in many years he had begun to care whether another person was safe, and that, in his world, was the most dangerous thing a man like him could allow to happen. The fragile peace of the farm was shattered one evening when the sound of tires grinding over the dirt road carried toward them, and Thane, though his wounds had not fully healed, sprang up with instinctive vigilance, pulled Maren behind him, and reached for the gun Renata had left for self-defense. Because in his world, a strange car appearing at that hour could only mean that the enemy had found him. And when the car door opened beneath the pale moonlight, the person who stepped out was a young man of about 22, his face still boyish, both hands raised to show he meant no harm, and Thane recognized him at once as Jonah Tate, one of the youngest soldiers in the organization, someone who should never have known he was still alive, much less found his way here. The first reflex in Thane's mind was cold as ice, that this boy was either a traitor sent to finish the unfinished work, or that, by accident or by choice, he had led the enemy behind him, and his hand tightened around the grip of the gun, because in the world where he had lived, every suspicion was resolved in the safest way for oneself, by removing the suspicion before it could become a threat. Jonah, seeing the muzzle of the gun and understanding exactly what it meant, still didn't run. Instead, he spoke in a rush, saying he hadn't betrayed him, that he was one of the very few who didn't believe the news that Thane was dead, that for weeks he had quietly followed the smallest clues, the conflicting statements of those who had been present that night, the place where the car had been found, the gaps in the story people had built, and that it was that very persistence that had led him here, not to harm Thane, but to find out whether he was truly still alive, because he couldn't bear the thought of the person who had betrayed him calmly taking everything. But that confession chilled Thane in another way, because if an ordinary foot soldier like Jonah could trace him here, then the enemy, with resources 100 times greater, could do the same. And whether he meant to or not, the boy had left behind a trail that could lead death straight to Maren's door, and in anger mixed with fear for the safety of the mother and child, Thane raised the gun with the familiar, ruthless logic that a leak had to be sealed, whether it came from good intentions or bad ones. It was then that Maren stepped forward, placing herself partly between the two men, not panicked at all, and spoke to him in the same calm voice she had used on the day she stopped his bleeding, saying that she had looked at enough people to tell the difference between the eyes of someone who had come to kill and the eyes of someone who had come because he still believed in something, and this young man belonged to the second kind. She asked him directly whether he had spent his whole life killing or throwing away everything he couldn't be certain of, and whether that way of living had, in the end, left him with anything except a loneliness so deep he had nearly died with no one beside him. The question hung suspended in the cold air, and Thane stood there for a long time, the gun in his hand suddenly heavy, because by every old rule he should have pulled the trigger. But the woman who had taught him that nothing was completely broken if someone was willing to look closely enough, was standing right there, looking at him with eyes that were both resolute and pleading, and for the first time in his life, the man who trusted no one lowered the barrel of the gun, choosing to place his trust in a human being instead of erasing him. And when he told Jonah to stand up and come inside, the young man looked at him with the eyes of someone who had just been given something more precious than his own life: trust. And no one in that miserable shed that night knew that the moment Thane Voss chose to trust instead of kill was the moment that planted the seed that would bloom and bear fruit in the darkest days still waiting ahead. The fact that Jonah had found the farm turned out to be only a warning of something far worse, because the same fragile links that had led him there had also begun leaking toward the enemy, and the man behind the entire betrayal was none other than Conrad Voss, Thane's own uncle, a 52-year-old man who had secretly hungered for the throne of the Empire for many years and had personally arranged the ambush that night with the firm belief that his nephew had rotted to death in the cold field. When faint rumors that Thane might still be alive began reaching him, Conrad didn't panic, but responded with the cruel calm of a man who had gone too far to turn back, because he knew that if Thane truly was alive, he had to end everything before his nephew could gather his forces and expose his betrayal before the entire family. And this time, he decided not to leave behind even the smallest opening. Conrad's men followed the very trail Jonah had unknowingly left, and on a gray, late autumn afternoon, dark-colored cars began appearing one by one along the dirt road leading to the farm, stopping at points that controlled every way in and every way out, while strange men with the stance of people used to carrying guns lingered near the end of the road, not charging in right away, but tightening the circle little by little in the manner of men who believed their prey was already trapped and only needed to wait for the right moment to strike the final blow. Thane recognized the signs at once, the way the world around him had suddenly gone unnaturally quiet. A few probing calls pretending to be wrong numbers, a strange car rolling slowly past the house twice, and he understood that the time for hiding was over, that Conrad had found him, and that this time he wouldn't aim at Thane alone, but would be willing to burn down everything around him to make certain no witness was left alive. But what made Thane's heart tighten wasn't the danger to himself, but the chilling truth that his fatal weakness was no longer himself, but the mother and child who belonged to the woman who had saved him. Conrad was the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to use innocent people as bargaining pieces, and the thought that Leah could be drawn into this trap made the man who had once remained cold before everything feel pure, numbing fear for the first time. It was in that urgent moment that Maren was the one who kept the clearest head. She didn't cry out and didn't panic. She immediately understood that the most important thing was to get her daughter out of there before everything broke open, and she did it with the calm of a mother used to handling situations on her own when no one came to help. She called Delphine in a deliberately gentle voice that revealed not a trace of fear, smoothly lying that she had to take an unexpected extra shift and asking her friend to watch Leah overnight, as she had done many times before. Then she went into her daughter's room, smiled brightly so the child wouldn't sense anything unusual, helped her pack a few outfits and a favorite toy into her backpack, turning the whole thing into a small adventure to Aunt Delphine's house, telling her to be good and promising that Mama would come get her in the morning. And when Delphine's car had disappeared completely at the end of the dirt road, carrying her little girl out of danger, Maren's shoulders trembled once before she immediately straightened again, because she knew the hardest part still lay ahead. She went back inside, looked straight at Thane, Renata, and Jonah as they tensely watched the figures near the road, and said in a firm voice that her daughter was safe, so now she needed to know what they planned to do, so the 3 people left in this house could walk out alive. And in the eyes of that woman now, there was no longer any trace of the hesitation she had shown on the day she stood beside the pool of blood in the shed, only the iron determination of someone who had chosen a side and would not step back, making even Thane look at her with a new respect, because he understood that the woman scorned by the whole town had just placed herself in the heart of the storm, not because she had been forced to, but because she had chosen it herself. Thane's first reflex was the reflex of the man he had always been. He began calculating a bloody counterattack, calling the names of those who might still be loyal, planning a direct confrontation to wipe out Conrad's men right there, because his whole life he had known only one language when cornered, the language of stronger violence. But Renata shook her head and pointed out that they had only 3 people and 1 gun, while Conrad had an army, and a gunfight here could lead to only one ending, all of them dead, and the air inside the house sank into a heavy kind of despair. It was then that Maren, who had been quietly listening all this time, spoke in her familiar, calm voice, saying that she knew nothing about guns or about moving troops and commanding men in their world, but she did know one thing she had learned from saving an entire flock of chickens everyone had called hopeless, that if you wanted to solve a problem, you didn't rush in and fight its surface. You had to look closely enough to see the real weakness holding the whole thing up, and she asked all three of them a simple question: what Conrad's entire strength was truly resting on right now. She answered it herself, saying that it didn't rest on the number of gunmen he had, but on one single thing: the belief everyone shared that Thane Voss was dead and had been removed from the game. That belief was the very foundation that allowed Conrad to sit on the throne smoothly, the thing that made the whole family obediently submit to him without anyone questioning it. And if that foundation was a lie, then all the power he had built upon it was as fragile as a chicken everyone had assumed was dead, when in truth, it was still breathing. She pointed out that if Thane charged into a bloody fight on this remote farm, then win or lose, he would only be playing exactly the game Conrad wanted: a death in the dark with no witnesses. But if, instead of hiding, he did the complete opposite of what his enemy expected, meaning he let his entire world see with their own eyes that he was alive at the exact time and place where Conrad couldn't silence the truth, then Thane's existence alone would be enough to collapse the lie holding up Conrad's entire empire, because the moment everyone learned Thane wasn't dead would also be the moment they were forced to ask themselves who had lied to them and why. Renata, who had spent her whole life inside the calculations of the underworld, looked at this woman who sold vegetables at the market with astonishment that slowly turned into real respect, and she admitted that in all her many years, she had never heard anyone lay out a move so sharp, because the plan didn't need many people or many guns. It only needed to strike the weakest vein of the opponent, turning the very support he relied on into the trap that would come crashing down on his own head. The three of them began gathering around the small kitchen table under the yellow light, and Marin took part in shaping the plan not as an outsider being pitied, but as a mind at the center of it. She asked Renata, who held enough standing in the family to summon a meeting Conrad couldn't refuse, asked Jonah what evidence of the ambush could still be collected, and which of the men who had carried it out might be shaken enough to turn and testify, asked Thane what place would be public enough to keep Conrad from acting openly, yet private enough that he wouldn't have time to prepare. And every question was sharp and right to the point, like the way she still turned each page of her notebook on the sick chickens. And as the plan slowly took shape inside that poor kitchen, Thane looked at the woman bent over the table, laying out each step with absolute focus, and he realized a truth that stunned even him, that the most powerful weapon in this house tonight wasn't Renata's gun, or Jonah's fists, or even his own empire that had once frightened 3 states, but the calm mind and clear eyes of a single mother who knew how to look straight at a problem. A woman the whole world had long ago pushed to the margins, as if she had nothing of value at all. The meeting was summoned exactly the way Marin had laid it out. A council meeting of the leaders within the Northeast Underworld Alliance, chaired by Owen Breslin, a 40-year-old man whose seniority and neutrality were enough to command respect, even from opposing factions. A man whose summons even Conrad couldn't refuse without exposing his own hidden corruption. Conrad stepped into that sealed room with the confidence of a man certain he had the entire game in his hands, already prepared with false words of grief for his unfortunate nephew and smooth phrases to formally take control of the empire. But all that composure shattered in a single moment, when the door at the far end of the room opened, and Thane Voss walked in, alive, standing straight, his cold gaze fixed directly on his uncle's face, and the whole room fell dead silent in the instant. Every lie collapsed at once. Just as Marin had foreseen, the mere presence of a man believed to be dead cracked the foundation Conrad had built, and every eye in the council immediately shifted from him to Thane, then back to him again, with silent questions sharp as knives. And before Conrad could rebuild his position, Thane began exposing layer after layer of evidence Jonah had patiently gathered. The testimony of one of the gunmen from that night, who had agreed to turn, the unusual money trails Renata had traced from the western branch, the undeniable connection between Conrad and the entire ambush, every piece falling exactly into place until the truth stood whole before the council, that Conrad had tried to murder a man of his own blood in order to steal power. Conrad denied it, then shouted, then tried to buy his way out. But this underworld operated on one iron law, that a man who betrayed his own blood was a man no one could ever trust again. And Owen Breslin, as chair of the meeting, declared that Conrad was stripped of all power and standing within the alliance, cutting him off from every resource that had once made him dangerous. Then came the moment the entire underworld room had been waiting for. The moment when, by every old law, Thane had every right to end the man who had put 2 bullets into his body. A gun was placed on the table within his reach, and no one in the council would have stopped him if he had picked it up. It was his right, the revenge this entire world acknowledged as just, and Conrad, for the first time in his life truly terrified, looked up at his nephew with the eyes of a man who knew he had lost. Thane picked up the gun, and the whole room held its breath. He pressed the muzzle to his uncle's forehead for a moment that stretched as long as eternity, and in his mind, what rose then wasn't the blood-hungry roar of the old self, but the image of a 6-year-old child holding a crippled chicken in her hands and saying that nothing was completely broken, the image of the woman who had chosen to stop a stranger's bleeding instead of turning away, and he understood that if he pulled the trigger now, he would forever remain the thing he had always believed himself to be, something broken beyond saving, and he would betray the very possibility of becoming someone different that Maren and Leah had shown him was real. And so, to the astonishment of everyone who had only ever known him as a ruthless man, Thane Voss lowered the gun, set it back on the table, and said in a low, clear voice that killing Conrad would be too easy and too merciful for him, that he would have to live and face the full consequences of what he had done according to the laws of the outside world, and he handed over the entire file of evidence on the attempted murder and Conrad's criminal activities to the path that would lead straight into the hands of federal prosecutors, a punishment longer and more humiliating than death, a reckoning that did not require Thane to put his own hands in blood. When Thane turned and walked out of the room, leaving his uncle collapsed behind him in the contempt of everyone present, he didn't feel weakened the way the old self inside him would once have warned. Instead, he felt a strange, clean lightness he had never tasted in all his life sunk in blood. And he knew, more clearly than ever, that the person who had truly saved his life wasn't only the one who had stopped his bleeding in the cold shed, but the one who had taught him how to look at himself closely enough to realize he wasn't completely broken. But the fairness of the law didn't mean Conrad would let go quietly, because a man who had lost everything was a man with nothing left to lose, and the moment the group stepped out into the dim, unsecured alley behind the building to reach their car, one of the gunmen still loyal to him drew his gun and aimed straight at Maren, the woman he blamed for the collapse of everything, and it all happened in a flash so quickly that afterward no one could piece it back together in full. The only person standing close enough and reacting fast enough was Jonah, the young man Thane had nearly decided to kill only a short time before, and without 1 second of hesitation, he threw himself between the gun muzzle and the woman who had persuaded the crime lord to believe in him. The bullet tore through his thigh with a sharp, cracking report, and Jonah collapsed onto the ground while the others immediately overpowered the shooter. Blood spread quickly across Jonah's pant leg, but he was alive, and while Renata urgently called for the underground doctor and Maren knelt down, pressing hard against his wound with the same hands that had once stopped Thane's bleeding, the young man still forced a pale smile and whispered to ask whether she was all right, and only after he heard her say she was unharmed did he allow the pain to carry him away. That bullet damaged part of the nerves and muscle in Jonah's leg, and though he survived, the doctors later confirmed that he would carry a crippled leg forever, that he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. And that truth carried an echo that left both Maren and Thane silent, because it immediately called back the sight of Leah's walk with her brace, called back the crippled chicken the little girl had saved, as if fate had deliberately carved onto the young man's body the very lesson around which the whole story had turned, that a human being did not become less valuable, simply because his body was no longer whole. After Jonah had been taken away and everything had briefly settled, Thane Voss stood alone in the cold yard, looking at the young man's blood darkening the ground, and something that had never happened in all his ruthless life began to rise inside him. Tears rolled down the face that had always been cold as stone, silent and impossible to stop, because he realized that the young man he had once regarded as a threat to be removed, a nameless pawn not worth troubling over, had just used his own body to shield the person Thane cherished, without needing a promise or a bargain in return. He went to Jonah's bedside in the underground hospital that night, sat beside the young man who was still half unconscious, and for the first time in his life, the man who had once ruled through fear spoke words of thanks to another human being. He said softly that he had been wrong to look at Jonah as something that could be thrown away, that he had nearly killed the very person willing to die for what was right, and that he owed him a debt his entire empire could never repay. When Jonah opened his eyes slightly and weakly, said he didn't regret that leg at all if losing it meant keeping a good person like Maren alive, Thane had to turn his face away to hide the thickness in his throat, because in the young man's simple words, he heard the exact philosophy a 6-year-old child had planted in his heart, that the value of a person did not lie in whether he was whole, but in what his heart chose to move toward. And standing in that quiet room, The man who had once believed he was broken beyond saving finally understood that the kindness Marin had sown had not stopped with him, but had quietly passed on to Jonah, and would keep traveling farther still, growing inside every life it touched. 6 months passed, and spring came to Ash Creek, carrying the kind of gentle light that spread itself across fields once gray beneath the cold. And the little farm at the edge of town was no longer the same broken place a wounded man had once dragged himself to in the night. The fence had been rebuilt, sturdy and straight. The shutter that had hung loose since that far-off autumn had finally been repaired, and the old shed that had once held the smell of blood and sick straw had become a clean, spacious chicken house flooded with sunlight. The flock that the whole town had once laughed at had now recovered and multiplied into a thriving, healthy brood, glossy, feathered, and bright-eyed, bustling about the carefully fenced yard in search of feed, and standing among them like an old, proud gatekeeper was Biscuit, the crippled chicken everyone had thought would be the first to die, now still walking with that familiar crooked leg of his but full of life, still the one Leah loved most, a living piece of proof that reminded anyone who saw him each morning that the thing her mother had always believed was true. Thane Voss was no longer the man he had been 6 months earlier. He had quietly withdrawn from the most brutal and blood-soaked parts of his empire, handing over or dismantling the darker operations he had once ruled through fear, not because he had suddenly become weak, but because he had found something worth protecting more than power alone, and he began using his enormous wealth and influence in a way the old man inside him wouldn't have known how to understand. Quietly pouring money into this dying Rust Belt town, buying back the old factory that had long been closed and reopening it, bringing work back to people who had grown used to being forgotten by the world. And he did all of that without needing anyone to know his name, because for the first time in his life he was doing something not to make people fear him or stand in awe of him, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Jonah, after long months of recovery, could now walk again, though he still carried the limp that would stay with him for the rest of his life. But the young man had never once looked at his crippled leg as a loss. He had become Thane's most trusted right hand in these new and decent endeavors, the one overseeing the rebuilding of the town, and in him people could clearly see the kindness Marin had once planted, now taking root and growing into a whole human being. He treated poor workers and people who had once gone astray, but wanted to start over with the very patience and trust he himself had once been given, as though that philosophy of never throwing anyone away had passed from the woman to the crime lord, and then to him, and every time it was given onward it multiplied instead of running dry. Marin was still Marin. She hadn't suddenly become wealthy or proud. She still woke early to tend the chickens, and still kept her habit of writing carefully in the notebook that had now grown thicker with many more pages. But one thing had changed. The town no longer looked at her with the same pitying eyes as before, because people were beginning, dimly, to understand that the strange rebirth of all Ash Creek had somehow begun with the very woman they had once mocked. And now and then some of them quietly came to her for advice, or simply to watch the way she worked, hoping to learn that same patient refusal to give up. In the late afternoons, people would often see the man who had once made 3 states tremble, sitting on the wooden steps of a simple farmhouse, quietly watching a little girl run and play among the chickens with a leg that was growing stronger all the time. And in that simple peace, there was a kind of wealth he had never once touched in all his years of fighting through the dark. On a late spring afternoon, when the sunlight had turned golden over the fields growing green again, Marin, Thane, and Leah sat together on the wooden porch of the little farmhouse, and in that ordinary moment there was a kind of wholeness none of them had ever dared to dream of, back in that winter, now long gone. Leah burst into laughter, slipped down from the porch step, and ran toward the flock of chickens, her legs now much steadier, though still carrying the traces of everything they had once had to overcome, and the little girl called Biscuit's name, her laughter ringing clear among the chickens bustling around her. Thane watched the child's small figure for a long while, then said softly that the west fence had another loose spot that needed bracing, and Marin, without taking her eyes off her daughter, answered that they could do it on Saturday. And he nodded and said Saturday, a tiny, everyday exchange so ordinary, it was almost meaningless. And yet inside that simple normalcy lived everything these 2 deeply wounded people had traveled such a long road of blood and tears to reach. A home, a tomorrow they could plan together, a life that no longer had to keep looking over its shoulder in fear. And if there is one thing this story wants to leave behind, it is the truth that this single mother lived with her whole life, and unknowingly taught to a man who had seemed beyond saving that no one and nothing in this world is completely broken until we stop looking at it with kind eyes, that the people the world is so quick to label useless, burdensome, or defeated are very often simply people. No one has taken the time to look at closely enough to see the real value inside them, and that kindness is unlike any other possession on earth, because it is the only thing that doesn't diminish when we give it away, but instead grows, multiplies, and passes from one heart to another, from a poor woman to a cold crime lord, then to a young man, then outward across an entire town, like a flame lighting countless other flames, without losing even a spark of itself. That is true power, not built on fear but on respect, not taking something from anyone but giving more to everyone, and it is also what turned a story that should have ended with a body in a cold field into a story about the rebirth of people life had seemed to cast aside. If today's story has touched your heart, please press the like button, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that each day you can hear many more meaningful and captivating stories. We would love to know how you feel about this story, and whether it reminds you of someone in real life, a person who was once underestimated, yet carried a precious heart within them, or a time when you yourself were trusted by someone at the exact moment the whole world had turned away. Please leave a few lines in the comments, sharing the feelings deep in your heart, because we always treasure and listen to every story and every thought you share, and perhaps your words may become a source of encouragement for some stranger who needs a little more faith. May every small story on this channel sow in your heart a little warmth, a little healing, and a simple reminder that every person around us deserves to be seen with respect and compassion. Thank you sincerely for listening all the way to the very last moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, and may every passing day be joyful, peaceful, and filled with happiness. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.